I'm really excited. I think we're going to have, a great conversation. Part of what I'm going to do here is I'm going to do a talk that's going to really cover like how did we get to this point, right? And I'm going to introduce, the PhD economic framework, and then after the talk, we can just engage in robust conversation. So any questions that you guys have on anything that was said or anything was in the book, or just questions that you have in general, we can kind of dive in and talk about. I just, encourage free flow, right, of information. It's a safe space. I think you guys will really like it. So I'm going to switch over and see if I can share my screen because as I kind of go through the talk, I'm going to take you guys through some PowerPoint presentations. I think it'll be powerful and profound by design, and I'm looking forward to your feedback. Chester, and I wrote a book called The Black Tax, The Cost of Being Black in America. And in that book, I take a look at the financial cost of discrimination against Black people. Normally, when people talk about discrimination, they tend to speak about it from the perspective of the injustice or the immorality associated with it. I wanted to look at it from the perspective of what is the cost? And more importantly, what does research from the finest institutions in the country say that cost is? So the book is broken into three parts. In the first part, I take a look at the financial cost of discrimination in the present day, like right now, in markets and areas that are really critical for wealth accumulation in the Black community. So that's the housing space, it's the automotive space, it's the insurance and financing behind that. It is the job search, it's high-end careers, it's online commerce, it's capital raising for business, so on and so forth. In the second part of the book, I do a look back from the time of slavery and kind of walk forward up into the present and really just go through a bunch of discriminatory practices that you guys may have heard of, but I look at it in terms of the economics, right? What was the cost? In the third part of the book, I take a look at kind of where are we right now economically. I introduce this framework, this economic framework called PhD, which stands for purchase, hire, and deposit in ways that create jobs, create and expand business, and provide capital, money, right, in the Black community. Why is that really important? Because, pre-COVID, we were missing about 6 million jobs across the broader Black community. And we were also missing 1.4 million businesses with employees. You may know that there are about 2.5 million, 6 million Black businesses. Unfortunately, of that total number, only about 4% of those have any employees, right? That 4% represents about 109,000 businesses. That 4% generates 70% of all the revenue from Black business, about $100 billion, and employs about 1 million people. And while we have 109,000 of those businesses, we're missing 1.4 million, right? And that, of course, is driving the gap in capital or net worth that we have in our families and our communities, which is in the many, many trillions of dollars. So what we're talking about are here's the challenge when it comes to effective problem solving. It's really tough to work with folks on solving a problem if A, they don't see the problem, or B, if they think you're the problem, right? So if you would just fix you, then we would be great. And I'll share a couple of platitudes with you that you may have heard. One of those are that Black folks are just simply not trying hard enough. That really has more to do with not getting ahead than any type of racial discrimination. You've got over 6 in 10 Americans that believe that. Or you may have heard that Black folks have the same chance as anybody else to get ahead in America, right? Over 6 in 10 Americans believe that as well. Or you might have heard that racism is an excuse for failure. The problem is mine. And instead of me taking responsibilities from my actions or inactions, I spend all my time blaming everybody else, right? Over, about 7 in 10 Americans believe that. The challenge is if that's the background thinking, right, then that thinking is going to show up in the policies and the plans and the programs that are designed to actually solve issues that affect our Now, one of the things that's really important for us to understand is to be able to really effectively solve problems, you got to have two important things at the foundation, at the basis. One is empathy, just your ability to put yourself in somebody else's shoes. to see things from their perspective and to understand how they got there, right? Which we call the pathology. And the other piece of it is understanding. And that's how we use data and information to make the world a better place for ourselves and for our fellow man, right? Right? Now, the first thing I need us all to understand that slavery by definition is a 100% tax on your labor. It means nothing that you produce is yours, right? As a matter of fact, not even you are yours. And there's many things from this period of time that we could never put a price on, right? That we could never value. We could never value what it is to be a woman and to be unable to control your body for the entirety of your life. We could never value what it is to be a man and to be unable to protect your loved ones, right? Your wife or mom or daughter, so on and so forth, right? But there are things that you can value. And one of those things is the labor extracted from millions of people over almost a 250-year period, right? And economists have taken a look at that. Some place the value of that labor extracted from 1619 to 1865 as high as 24 trillion. Others place the number as high as 97 trillion. If we assume that the truth is somewhere in the middle, you can say it's as high as $50 trillion, labor extracted from millions of people for almost a 250-year period. That number is massive and it may be new to you, but that's not the only thing that we can value, right, from that time. If you go back to 1860, you've got almost 4 million people held in bondage, right? They represent 50% of the full economic value of the South. They are the most liquid asset in the country, and they are traded, bought and sold on open markets. So there are prices for these people, right? And there's a price if you're old or young, male, female, able-bodied, or lame. So it turns out that the value of these folks is so large, it's so significant that you have to put it in terms of national wealth or national income, right? So economists put the value in terms of US wealth between 16 and 20% of US wealth, or 1 to 2 years of GDP, which is just a fancy way of saying the national income, right? So if you look at it from a wealth perspective, it's about $15.5 trillion. US wealth in 2016 was about 85 trillion. 16 to 20% of that is 14 to 17 trillion. If you take an average of those two, you're at 15.5. If you look at it from an income perspective, it's about $28.5 trillion. National income is roughly, this is pre-COVID, about 19 trillion a year, right? So 1 to 2 years is 19 to 38 trillion. If you take an average of those, you're at 28.5. That's two different ways to come up with the value of what those people are worth in today's dollars. If you take an average of those two, we're at 22 trillion, right? If you go back to 1839, Henry Clay in the US Senate is putting a value on people held in bondage at that time. And he places that value at $1.2 billion at that time, right? Slave-related returns from investments in slavery is 6 to 8% per year. If we take something that's even lower than that at 5.5, and you put that in today's dollars, it'll be over $24 trillion. If you go back to the 1810s, you have Thomas Jefferson, who we are all familiar with, and James Madison, and they placed the value of Black people held in bondage at their time at roughly 1 year of national income or GDP. That would be the equivalent of $19 trillion today, or they say it would require the sale of 1/3 of all public lands. The point here is that the value of these folks with respect to the country is enormous and massive and really, hard to conceive. Which is if you take all the assets and all the liabilities and subtract the two, what's left? 45 million plus, African Americans today, it's roughly $1.5 trillion. But we just established that 4 million people held in bondage in 1860, over 150 years ago, had an economic value of about 22 trillion in today's equivalent. That means that 4 million people held in bondage in 1860 were worth 15 times more than 45 million people who are free today, right? 153 years later. That's just the math. Well, why is it that Black people have not done well, right? There's been plenty of time to correct that. And here's the challenge with that. Those people left bondage with no economic resources, right? If you go back to 1870, Black folks own about 0.17% of US wealth, effectively nothing. And I'm sure you remember from social studies or history class, they kind of talk about 40 acres and a mule and the Homestead Act, right? We all know that 40 acres and a mule was never actually distributed. That was a discussion about providing some startup capital in terms of land, and a mule to help newly freed people get a start in life post-emancipation. What I always thought was interesting is what would that have been worth in today's dollars, right? Both the 40 acres and a mule and the Homestead Act. So if we take a look at that, you got, 4 million people held in bondage. 40 acres, per person is 160 million acres. It's just a gigantic amount of land. If you look at the cost of an acre in the US, it varies between roughly $3,020 and $6,350. By the way, this is farmland that we're talking about. We are not talking about, LA acres or Bay Area acres or Manhattan or Miami or any of that kind of stuff, right? This is just kind of farmland. Quick math puts that as high as $1 trillion in today's equivalent, which would be generating about $90 billion a year. That's what that would have been worth economically if it had been distributed in today's dollars. But that never occurred. And even though that 1 trillion is a really large number, it's only about 2% of the 50 trillion that was extracted from those folks and from their predecessors. Passed an act called the Homestead Act, in which they would proceed to distribute 246 million acres to about 1.5 million white families, right? Over the next 60-year period, massive distribution of land. If we look at it from the same perspective, in terms of the value of an acre of farmland, it would place the value of that distribution at about $1.6 trillion, or roughly about $1 million per family. Now, I'm all about hard work and bootstraps, but $1 million is a hell of a start, right? In life. So how did this thing work? The way it worked was that you had the opportunity to claim about 160 acres, right, of land. And if you were so fortunate to be able to make that claim, if you stayed on that land for about 5 years, you could take possession of it at the end of it without actually paying anything for it. Now, if you were from Europe and you came over here, and you came with nothing but the shirt on your back, which many people did, and you were so fortunate to be able to claim one of these lots, at the end of 5 years, not only did you take possession of that land, but you also could naturalize or become a citizen, because that's how long it took you to become a citizen, back in those days. So imagine coming from a land of destitution to a land of plenty and having a start like this. Now, researchers say that in terms of direct beneficiaries, there's up to 93 million Americans that are direct beneficiaries of this. So not secondary, tertiary, they're related to it in some way or form, direct beneficiaries, right? So on the one hand, you've got $1 trillion of economic resources denied to a group for whom so much was taken from in the first place, and then, almost 2 trillion distributed to, 1.5 million, white families. So if we fast period of the Civil War, and emancipation. The Southern economy is devastated, right? The global cotton market is devastated. The land confiscated in the South is returned to the white planter class. What we have to remember is because of the rebellion of the South, which is actual literal treason, all of their land was confiscated by the North. So it did not belong to them, but it was returned to them after they were defeated. And the world, people need large, cheap, readily available labor. Now, I'm gonna just circle back here because there's a lot that's going on during this period. The short version is the global cotton market employed about 20 million people. 1 million of those people lost their jobs. Cotton was the equivalent of oil, right? In terms of its effect. Raw cotton from the United States dominated 80% of the total market. And raw cotton picked by Black people in the South was about 61% of US export. I mean, you just can't beat free labor and the global dominance, associated with what Black people in the South were doing. And the economic value of those people is 50% of everything in the South. So, and the Civil War creates this thing called a global cotton famine, which is all these industrialized countries that are using um, this raw material. You know, they don't have it. They don't have as much. So it affects Egypt. It affects India. It affects Europe. It affects Japan. It affects like the whole industrial world. So the world is crying out, what is America going to do to put her newly freed people back to work? Right? And the answer and a solution to that is this thing that we call Jim Crow. Now, Jim Crow of laws and customs that's reinforced with an extraordinary level of violence to reimpose 100% tax on a sharecropper's labor. Now, I know it sounds hyperbolic. I know it sounds like I'm going overboard by saying 100% tax on people's labor after slavery, right? But what I will do is I will let you decide whether or not you think it really is 100% tax. So let's talk about this kind of sharecropping, what it is, and how does it work. So after emancipation, those large mega plantations were broken into smaller lots, right? Black families would agree to settle on those lots and plant cash crops. And at the end of the season, they would share in a portion of the crop that they brought to market. Literally, that's where the name comes from, sharecropping. What we got to understand is it was an actual contract that the family signed, right, with a white landowner. All the terms and conditions of that contract were set by the small white farmer. Some of those terms and conditions said that if you fell ill during that harvest and you couldn't do your work, they could outsource it to somebody else, have somebody else do it, and then charge you back for what it cost them to have somebody else do your portion of it. The other thing that we have to understand is that those people left with virtually no economic resources whatsoever. And if the harvest doesn't come tomorrow, it comes at the end of the year or at the end of the season. So between now and then, that farmer has to provide you with the tools and the fertilizer and clothes and house and meals, everything that you need, right? And they're doing that on credit at interest rates as high as 70% per year. So they're setting what all your expenses are, right? And the value of your expenses. The other thing is that at the end of the year, when you take these crops to market, that white farmer is the market. That person tells you what your crops are worth. Now think about this. If a person controls your costs and they control your revenue, your income, because they tell you what it's worth, by definition, that means they control your profit. And I think you start to see where I mean by 100% tax, right? So if you're fortunate, your profit will be zero at the end of the year. If you're unfortunate, because they don't want you to go to someone else who might be more generous, your profit will be negative, which means you owe them. They'll roll that into next year, and now you're in perpetual debt servitude. Very difficult to accumulate wealth and resources under this kind of construct. Right? And then you can get to the other side. But this wasn't a bad 3 or 4 year period, or even 5 year period, or even 10 year period, right? This thing lasted for roughly 75 years, from about 1870 or so to about 1945, during which time 4,000 Black people were lynched. That's a public execution by your fellow American, right? Nobody's been prosecuted for those executions. It's the equivalent of one Black person per week being executed for 75 years, right? Under those types of conditions, you'll get the hint, your family gets the hint, your church gets the hint, your community gets the hint, right? And there is a quote from a farmer, a sharecropper in the Mississippi Delta. And he said, listen, I've been working these deltas for 30 years, and I know every year I've been robbed. But what can I do? If you speak up, you get cussed. If you raise up, you get shot, right? And that ends that. So if someone controls your revenue, they control your costs, and they can do what they want with impunity, you can see that that's 100% tax on your labor. And if that is the case, that means that by definition, it is slavery. And that's why this period of time is called slavery by another name. You guys may have heard that, right? So if we think about that, right, during a period of legal state enforced slavery, up to 50 trillion was extracted from people. And this was the equivalent of that in terms of extraction. It lasted for 75 years, which is another third of that period. That you can argue over the next 75 years, they were able to extract another 15 trillion from Black people. If you go back to 1860, you got 4 million Black people working in the fields in the South. If you fast forward to 1935, you still got almost 4 million Black people working in the South under the sharecropper tenant farmer type, conditions, right? So the way to understand this is that upon emancipation and the end of the Civil War, that white Panther class loses about $22 trillion worth of value at that time. But then over the next 75 years or so, they would claw back about 15 trillion from newly freed people and their descendants, right? So when we start to think about the impact of Jim Crow, we're talking about massive, enormous amounts, right? Now, it's a true statement, right? What we have to understand from a contextual perspective is, upon emancipation, the white planter class was not interested in educating newly freed Black people. Their children were educated in a private system. They wanted massive, cheap, abundant labor. Um, but the smaller white farmers did want to expand public education for their children. Obviously, newly freed people wanted expanded public education. The large planter class needed the help of the smaller white farmers, so they agreed to expand public education, but with the intention of diverting resources from Black children to white children. If you look at the words of W.E.B. Du Bois, he says, in the 40 years since emancipation, Negro taxes and the Negro share of income from indirect taxes has fully repaid, right, any investment in a Negro's education. This is by white people. The point he was making is so little was invested in newly freed people's education that what was invested by Black people covered what had already been done by white people. The interest was not in developing Black folks. And if you think of the words of Thomas Logan, who is a former Confederate general, and he was an industrialist at the time, he echoes the sentiment of that class, which is when the freedman regards himself qualified to earn a support by mental work, he is unwilling to accept manual labor. By mental work, it means using your intellectual horsepower and skill set and prowess to do work with your mind, as opposed to doing work with your body. And they were interested in Black people doing work with their bodies. If you look at the words of William H. Baldwin, who was the president of the General Education Board at the time, back in 1914, what he says, and he's kind of like the Department of Education before the Department of Education. That's the way to think of his role. He says the South needed Negroes educated so they could be the best possible laborers, right? With the right kind of education, Negroes will willingly work menial jobs, and that will open up opportunities for Southern whites to work the more expert labor. What you need to understand is under slavery, 64 public high schools in the South for Black people. Again, that's not a district, that's not a city, that's not a state, that's across the entire South, right? Very little investment in the education of Black people. And most schoolhouses were built and owned by Black people. Obviously, these were appendages to to churches and to church facilities. If you go to 1920 and the New York City public school system, New York is investing 50 times more per child. 50 times more than South Carolina is investing in the Black children and their segregated school system. Just think about that. Think about if you came from Europe with nothing, but you move into an area where they're investing 50 times more in your education, your human capital development, than a child in South Carolina is getting, whose family and legacy has been here for hundreds of years. Again, in the South, for every dollar invested to educate a Black child, 5 to 8 were invested to educate a white child. That's not, we don't need rocket science to analyze that. If you do that with your own family, one child is going to go to Harvard, the other one's going to be impoverished, right? Black teachers in the South are earning about 25 to 34 cents on a dollar to what their white peers are earning for the same subject matter. And white students are receiving 50 years more of education than Black students by the time they reach the age of 25, right? The level of malinvestment, right, in the education of Black people is so great that Gary Becker, who wrote The Economics of Discrimination and is also a Nobel Prize winner, said that in the last 50 years, and he said this in the 1950s, Negroes have advanced little in relative occupational hierarchy. So it just means you open up a new plant, there's another new role for a Black janitor, right? Not for a Black manager, and so on and so forth. And then, of course, researchers say that if you'd kept the other discrimination the same, but invested equally in the children, right, during the educational process, That alone could have cut the wage gap by about 50%, right? So if you look at that over a generation of millions of Black children, that's over $600 billion of loss associated with that. If you look at that over multiple generations, over a 90-year period from 1865 to 1954, we have Brown v. Board of Education. We're talking about over $3 trillion of loss due to malinvestment into Black children and to Black people, right? Super duper education wasn't all that important. We all have a story about a relative, maybe a grandfather or great grandfather that only had a third grade or fifth grade education, but an incredible work ethic. And they built a home and they did phenomenal things for their families, right? Which is extremely true. And so what you needed was really housing, right? And that was the great wealth builder, which is very true. As we all know, being a homeowner is part of the American dream, and the government takes it very seriously, and they invest accordingly in that dream, which is a wonderful thing, right? You know, at the time, the government invested $120 billion, which is the equivalent of about $1 trillion today, in subsidizing, home acquisition for its citizens, right? Which is a wonderful thing. Had everything to do with the creation of kind of the middle class that exists today. The challenge with that is that less than 2% of all that investment went to Black Americans, right? However, the 20 plus million Europeans that immigrated here after they became citizens had access to all those resources, but Black people who had been here and whose lineage had been here for hundreds of years. So you got a complete wall that prevents Black people from getting into communities that are better resourced for the development of their children. You know, all that sounds really touchy-feely and qualitative, but what we can say in a concrete way is that between 1930 and 1960, less than 1% of all mortgages in the country went to Black people. Now, mind you, the real estate market within America is the greatest wealth building institution that the world has ever known. On average, real estate is about 64% of the wealth of the average Black family. It's super critical, right? And Black people were largely prevented from being able to do so. Now, a contract sale. These are unregulated markets. You don't have to have an appraisal. People are selling homes at 2 times their value. They're having extreme interest rates. And there is no equity in the house as you pay it off, right? That's actually the worst part of the whole construct. The way it would work is if you made an agreement to make 100 payments and then you take possession of a house, if you made 99 of those payments, miss the 100th, they could keep your 99 payments, keep your down payments, evict you from the house, resell it to somebody else. Again, very extremely difficult, right, to accumulate wealth under this construct. If you think about that Chicagoland area, that greater Chicago area, which is a huge area for migration for Black people who left the South during that time period, in the 50s, it's estimated that 85% of all real estate transactions for Black people in that area was under this construct of contract sales, right? Very difficult to accumulate wealth. In 1968, and they found that goods and services, things sold within these communities, were selling at 3 times the value that they actually were worth, 3 times what they were worth outside of these communities. Very difficult to accumulate wealth. And if you just wanted to hunker down and just kind of work hard, you had to deal with discrimination in the labor market. And researchers place that level of discrimination, what it actually costs Black people, right, in terms of salary and other benefits, at $1.6 trillion in 1983 dollars. If you put that into today's dollars, it's over $4 trillion. Extremely difficult to accumulate resources under those circumstances. This is, so if we look at, like, you know, white Americans born between 1943 and 1951, they would go on to accumulate 11 times more wealth than their peers, Black peers who were born at that time. You know, what we're led to believe is that's about the decisions that you've made or not made. It's about hard work and stick-to-itiveness and determination, all those kinds of things. But when you really take a look at the data and the context, you see that the environment, right, has so much more to do with that difference in wealth than we were kind of otherwise led to believe. Talk a little bit about that. So right now, the Black community is missing about $1.5 trillion worth of income. $1 trillion of that is from the missing businesses that we have within our community. half a trillion of that is associated with consumer income, right? That's just, salaries and so on and so forth of the kind of Black public. We talked about a massive gap in wealth that we're missing. It's actually much larger than this amount now. And we previously talked about the missing jobs and businesses across the Black community, which is even worse now given the COVID epidemic. When I was doing research for the book, I saw this number that kept coming up again and again and again. And it was 2%, 2%, 2%. So it felt like a rule or a paradigm of some kind. And it seemed like for areas that are really critical to wealth accumulation for Black people, we tend to hover around a participation rate of about 2%. Let me give you a couple of examples. If you look at corporate supply chain spend, now corporate supply chain is just companies buy stuff from other companies so they can make their products, right? Every company, every institution, every government, every household has to do that. You got to buy stuff from other people to meet your goals. We call that supply chain spend. Less than 2% of that is spent on Black business. Again, I'm not talking about minority business. I'm talking about Black business specifically. If you look at government supply chain spend, the government spends an incredible amount of money buying stuff from all kinds of businesses. At every level, federal, state, local, it's less than 2% that goes to Black enterprise. If you even look at the spend that Black people have amongst themselves, less than 2% of our total income, which is roughly 1.2 trillion, goes to Black enterprise, which is problematic. If you look at really high growth, high compensation fields, technology, and a whole number of other places, our rate of participation or number of Black people tends to be around 2% level across all of it. If you even look at the banking industry or the banking system, only $4 out of every $10,000 in the U.S. banking system is in a Black bank. They just don't have enough resources to provide the loans and the capital to businesses that would need them. And even if you look at the Small Business Administration, which provides lending to small businesses, less than 2% of that goes to Black enterprise, right? It's roughly 1.6%. So all of this creates a very negative, depressive impact on job creation and business development in the Black community. When I did a talk, my first talk at Google, right, when it came to the cost of discrimination for Black people, could you also tell us a little bit about what the cost has been for the country? I thought that was a brilliant question. I did not have the answer at the time. I told them that I would think about it and I would get back to them. I was fortunate enough to be asked to come back to Google and speak a second time, which I appreciated it. And I answered the question at that time, and I'll share that answer with you guys, right? And I looked at it from this perspective. What if Black Americans have been allowed to participate fully in the innovation system that drove the economy, right? Now, I spent a lot of time talking to you about this period, right, of Jim Crow from 1870 to 1945. But what we got to remember is that this period is one of the most important periods of the Industrial Revolution, right? At the same time, you got 2.5 million patents are created, right? A patent is a great idea that you come up with that's new and transformative, and it gets allocated to you. And for a certain period of time, you can make money off of that idea. Things that were discovered created during that period of time, you're talking about the telephone and the light bulb and the radios and motion pictures and photocopiers and airplanes and automobiles and transistors and semiconductors, everything that's really critical for our economy right now. Those innovations were happening, at that period of time. 2.5 million patents were created, right? How many from Black people? 726. Are attributed to Black people out of 2.5 million total created. That's almost a complete shutout, inability to participate in that. Why is this really important? If you look at Professor Kortun from Yale, he says that patents can be thought of as proportional improvements in productivity, and that a constant rate of new patents can generate a constant rate of new economic growth. This is true, it's empirical. You can look this up, it exists, right? The Brookings Institute said the nation's unequal access to high quality education deprives the innovation system of people who might otherwise create or commercialize important discoveries. This is really important. Now, something I want to kind of emphasize and re-emphasize is that talent, skill, capability, all that stuff follows what's called a normal distribution. Fancy way of saying 70% of the people tend to be in the middle, 15% tend to be significantly above average. I call that the ultra brilliant. We all like to think we're part of that group, right? And then 15% are below average. I thought a really important question. was, what was the size of that 15%, that ultra brilliant portion of the Black population during this period of time that we just examined? And what was that brilliance actually doing, right? So if you go back to 1870, that's about 700 plus thousand people. Again, that's not the population of Black people, that's just that 15% of ultra brilliant. 1900 is roughly 1.3 million. 1930, it's almost 1.8. 1950 is 2.3. What was that brilliance doing, right? You're talking about sharecropping and tenant farming, right? The application of that brilliance was fully underutilized during that period of time. What did that cost the country? What was the impact in terms of income and wealth for America because of that underutilization? If those people had been utilized appropriately, we would have seen 280,000 more patents. That would have led to over $2 trillion more in national income for the nation, right? On top of what we're seeing now, and over $9 trillion more of wealth. That's what was lost by those people. From Michigan State did a really interesting study. She said, what if white people experienced the level of trauma that Black people experience? What would have happened to innovation specifically? And her research says that if white people experience the level of trauma Black people experienced during that time, 40% of those patents would have never been created. That's 1 million patents straight off the books right away. Which of those things could we afford to lose? What would have been the economic impact? The economic impact would have been almost a $8 trillion impact to national income and $30+ trillion of wealth that would have been lost. The thing we all have to know is that discrimination has a negative impact. It costs both the party that discriminates and the person who gets discriminated against. We've seen that cost for Black people is massive and gargantuan and hard to comprehend, but it's also been massive for the country. I'm going to leave you with kind of 2 quotes here. The first being from Albert Einstein, and he said that the worst disease under which the society of our nation suffers, in my opinion, is the treatment of the Negro. And I've covered a little bit of that from an economic perspective in this talk. And then the second quote is from Emperor Selassie in his address to the United Nations in 1963. And he said the basis for racial discrimination has been economic, and it is with economics that these evils can be overcome. With that said, we can pause.
Process that happened before when we talk about indentured servitude when it came to England and Ireland, where the landowners in England would lease out or allow these sharecropper people to work the land in Ireland. And once the crop came in, of course, they took the majority of the crop. And with indentured servitude, you could never get out of debt because they charged them for the materials, the seeds, the everything. So the Jim Crow laws, and from my perspective, equates to what was going on with indentured servitude. And I was watching a public television program not too long ago, and they had a professor of economics from Duke University, and he made a statement on that show that day that white Americans without a high school education has a greater percentage of wealth in this country than 2/3 of the minority population that has a college or advanced college educational degree in this country. And I found that fascinating.
Our minds are associative by nature. So if we don't understand how things came to be, we're just going to make an association between the people and the environment. Yes. And we're going to say that the outcomes that Black people are experiencing are because of things that Black people have done or not done, right? And if you believe that, then why do you need to do anything to invest in them to change the situation? But if you can have like a fact-based conversation that just kind of lays out how things evolved, and it actually didn't evolve, how it was constructed, right, to be in this place, it just becomes self-evident, right? A lot of people they have no idea about this, and how could they know? It's not in the curriculum in K through 12, right? It's not at university, and it's certainly not in our other institutions. So the knowing of this is really important to break down a lot of barriers and to have an effective conversation and to really help people to empathize and to understand and then start being a part of the solutioning of this, right? The Jim Crow construct was elegant, nefarious and diabolical in design. There was no getting out of it. There was no, you weren't going to MacGyver your way out of it. There was no Hollywood version of, if it was me, I would have somehow done something else. And it's important for people who did not experience that and who are not, you know, a part of the Black community, particularly with that lineage, to really understand that. And to understand that not only was it a bad thing and a horrible thing and all these kind of qualitative terms, this took trillions of dollars out of the Black community. And money is temporal. That which we do today will have an impact in the future. You sacrifice today so that our children and their children and their children will have something. And if that is stripped away from people today, there's nothing to leave for tomorrow, right? So it was just to lay that out in a really fact-based way that's not, you know, emotional or hyperbolic, so that we can have really productive conversations.
To Shawn just share these facts with us. I didn't say it in these kind of words, but that's messed up. But also it tells me that we're right where we should be in helping these young guys understand that we teach them these principles, and we tell them that these principles will guide them in the wilderness. It'll guide them when things are good, and it'll guide them when it's bad. Now, when I listen to Shawn talk, and I talked to Shawn earlier about this, I say, listen, okay. I said, for sure, this information need to be dispersed to our people, but then we also need solutions, because we live in a spiritual universe, guys, and we're spiritual beings. And one of the things that we have to understand that is this, that in all adversity, the Creator says that I'll put an equal or greater benefit. And so when I listen to this information with the kind of thinking I have, the first thing I'm saying is, wow, they might have devalued us as far as what they gave us, but look what we produced, although they kept it all. And so principles that Boss shared with these young folks, and Shawn had talked about the challenges, and one of them was this. So I'm saying blaming and complaining. And we taught these young guys in our conference that there's some things that stop folks from ever reaching their greatness. And one of them is blaming and complaining. See, now all of this exists. Be mindful of that it's unfair, it's hard and it's rough, but just like in the book, The Road Less Traveled, once we accept this, it don't matter anymore. I'm here today, Boss is here today, Mr. Franklin is here today, Shawn is here today to say, listen, but what is all this saying about us? That from when slavery began to October the 10th, 2020, we're sitting up here with cell phones. We're sitting here with computers. Now, is that enough? Absolutely not. But what it says is we're some incredible people. And if we understand that, Everett, if we understand that if we go to work, because somebody back then didn't buy that stuff, right? Because look at where we are, but also I thought about this. Shawn talked about how they saw the value of making sure that we was educated to continue to be the labor in the craft that we was involved in, but also they seen the value of a miseducation so that we was willingly take menial jobs, that we willingly got exploited. And that's why we're here, guys, because we gotta realize that a lot of the slavery was mental. A lot of the things that's the problems we in because we put up with it. Yeah, they kept all the money, but the truth of the matter is this, that we go through trillions of dollars. And I seen a report, and I think Shawn said it too, but they don't make us take that $1 trillion and spend it with them. We choose to. As a matter of fact, the miseducation of us make us where we don't even really want to spend any money with each other. We don't like, we have problems with each other. And the reason is this, that our genetic biology, which we teach to the young guys, is how you think, how you act, and how you feel. And how you think and how you act and how you feel creates what is called your personality. And your personality, as you know, Everett, and all the young men on this call, your personality creates your personal reality. And that being true, then a lot of our issues, right, is how we're thinking. And the problem is this: if we're going to solve this, Shawn, if we're going to change this, we can't do like we've been trying to do. We're trying to change our reality with the same personality, and it will not work.